My name is John Henry, and most of my academic life was spent at the California State University, Sacramento, where I'm professor emeritus. I have spent approximately 12 years at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. I'm currently associated with the Livingston Economics Institute, Bard College, where I'm senior scholar, and also research scholar at the Binzager Institute. Now, as you are followers of the various materials put forward by Binzager, you are all acquainted with various job guarantee programs as well as the modern money approach to government spending and related matters. As such, it is worthwhile revisiting programs in the 1930s established under the Roosevelt Administration, in particular the WPA, initially known as the Works Progress Administration, and then renamed in 1939 as the Work Projects Administration. I think that the word progress was a bit too radical for many individuals because government was assuming responsibility for at least increasing employment. In any case, the WPA was probably the centerpiece. In fact, I would eliminate the word probably. It was the centerpiece of the Roosevelt Administration programs. Now, a little background is necessary. Roosevelt and those closely associated with Roosevelt, the brain trust, so-called, Roosevelt was not a progressive, at least in modern terms. When he ran for president, he ran on a balanced budget program and initially slashed federal spending, specifically, and this may be a little surprising, specifically in the areas of military spending, including veterans' benefits, pensions, and whatever. And what is not surprising, education and science and technology, federal programs. You might recall, if you have historic information in front of you, that in 1937, Roosevelt attempted to return to a balanced budget. The balanced budget was always in the forefront. As a consequence, an economy that was seemingly recovering from the Depression went back into a depressed state in 1938. What pulled the US and other economies out of the Great Depression was World War II. And that's when you saw a tremendous increase in government spending and accompanying deficits. And the result was, of course, a thriving, basically fully employed economy. In any case, why did the Roosevelt administration invoke these various programs, in particular the WPA? As a consequence of the Depression, there was a great deal of discontent, political discontent in the United States. And not just the United States, obviously, but we're concerned with developments in this country. There was a farmers' revolt, including armed action at farm foreclosures. A farm was being foreclosed, auctioned off. One of the adjoining farmers would bid $1, and if somebody proposed a higher price, the shotguns would be pumped, right? And that bid was rescinded. At the end of the auction, the farm was bought for $1. The farmer who bought it would return the deed to the farmer whose farm was foreclosed, and they would go off on their merry ways. There were urban demonstrations. New York, Chicago, other major cities saw major demonstrations. The coal fields in Kentucky and West Virginia suffered what were called riots during the 1930s. One must also remember that the Communist Party in the United States was fairly large as these parties go and extremely popular. I have one quote from Hamilton Fish, who was a major political figure of the period, instructing his fellow congressmen. If we don't give security under the existing system, the people will change the system. Make no mistake about that. And there was, in fact, considerably fear that revolution was in the air. I think that was overstated, but nevertheless, we can find evidence that that's the way various political figures saw the 1930s. Now, the WPA was one of several programs developed to respond to this supposed revolutionary threat. The first such program was the Federal Emergency Administration of Public Works, established in 1933, renamed in 1939 as the Public Works Administration. Under the auspices of the PWA, the government allocated over $6 billion to private firms for the construction of various infrastructure projects. The Grand Coulee Dam, for example, was constructed under the auspices of the PWA. Various hospitals, bridges, the Triborough Bridge and the Lincoln Tunnel in New York City, and the list goes on. Now, the significant aspect of the PWA is that government simply allocated monies, which is what they do now, right? When government decides that the U.S. Navy needs a new aircraft carrier, they simply allocate monies to the builders of the carrier, and that's it. In that same year, 1933, the Civilian Conservation Corps was established. This was actually Roosevelt's favorite program. Roosevelt actually was not in favor of public works programs, such as the WPA. He was in favor of the Civilian Conservation Corps. Roosevelt was an environmentalist. And the Civilian Conservation Corps employed over 2 million young men over the course of its history, undertaking reforestation, the construction of hiking trails, state parks. The California State Park System was essentially constructed by the CCC, and engaging in various environmental activities. Here's a little known factoid for you. If you look at Roosevelt's income tax returns, he lists his occupation, even when he was president, as farmer. In his estate, Hyde Park, New York, which is just south of where I'm currently working at the Levy Institute, what you will see is that Roosevelt was an active individual in terms of, in particular, reforestation in that part of New York. So the Civilian Conservation Corps was something that was very much akin to his own interests, and that was the organization that he most heavily promoted. The difference between the Civilian Conservation Corps and the PWA is this. The Civilian Conservation Corps featured government hiring the workers, the young male workers who engaged in these projects, right? So it wasn't just the government throwing money at large construction firms. It was the government actively employing individuals under government contract. And that funding relationship was the basis of the funding for the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, as it was initially called. Now, the WPA was under the direction of Harry Hopkins, a notable figure in his day. And while the program was officially terminated in 1943, it effectively ended in 1941 when the United States entered World War II. And then, of course, with the increased employment associated with military activity, there was no longer a need for the WPA, at least as far as the perception was concerned. Now, on average, through 1941, the WPA employed about 3 million people monthly. If we include employees in the Civilian Conservation Corps and the National Youth Administration, that was a separate organization under the WPA, that number increases to roughly 4.3 million people per month, representing 8 to 9% of the U.S. labor force. That's a significant percentage. Now, originally, the WPA was an extension of the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. This is the first time that the federal government engaged in what we now call welfare. Previous to that program, all welfare was administered at the state and local levels. The state and local governments had run out of money. They could not, in fact, fund any welfare programs, so the federal government stepped in. Now, the rationale under which the WPA was organized was that it was better to fund people to actually work than to simply put them on the dole, right? A perfectly reasonable position. And now the question, though, becomes, and we'll deal with this, and there's a slideshow that will show you some of the results of this program. What was that work? Because a standard objection to the WPA that you still hear is that this was simply make work projects. Well, the slideshow will demonstrate something quite different, right? Under the WPA, a maximum work week was set at 30 hours. Pay was set at the prevailing wage in various parts of the country. Now, this latter standard, prevailing wage standard, raised some unintended humorous criticism. Not many of you who are watching this know who Senator Richard Russell of Georgia was. He was one of the most reactionary, racist senators that the United States had ever seen. Anyway, he complained about this prevailing wage provision. Quote, "In the state of Tennessee, the man who is working with a pick and shovel at 18 cents an hour is limited to $26 a month, and he must work 144 hours to earn $26. Whereas the man who is working in Pennsylvania has to work only 30 hours to earn $94 out of funds which are being paid of the common treasury of the United States." In other words, the protest wasn't against 18 cents an hour wage in Tennessee. The protest was against the differential wages that were being paid in states, right, that had a much higher wage standard, right? I mean, can you imagine 18 cents an hour, even in the 1930s? Obviously, that's going to result in extreme poverty, even if you have a full-time job. Now, the WPA was not intended as a full employment program. Only one household member could be employed under the program, and these were usually males, though there were some female heads of households so employed. It should also be noted that state and local governments were required to contribute 10 to 30% of the costs of the various projects undertaken, right? So it wasn't simply a federal program per se, right? State and local governments had to participate, and in fact, there was a good reason for that, because all of the projects undertaken through the WPA were initiated at the local level, right? In other words, it was not the federal government who moved into a particular area and say, we are going to do this. It was local governments who said, we would like this project undertaken. And then there was a review process, and eventually the project was done. Now, over its life, total spending on WPA projects, including state and local spending, amounted to about $13.5 billion. Roughly 2% of gross domestic product over those years, roughly 8 years of its real existence. A piddling amount, 2%, okay? Now, what were those projects? And again, the slideshow will give you an indication as to what some of these projects were, but a truncated tally indicates the following. 560,000 miles of roads built or improved, 20,000 miles of water mains and sewers constructed, 417 dams, 325 firehouses built, 2,384 renovated, 5,000 schools constructed or renovated. Schools, if you exclude post offices accounted for roughly 40% of the total projects. If you exclude post offices, the greatest emphasis was on school buildings, right? The least emphasis was on jails. Now, if you know anything about government spending today, you're aware, particularly if you lived in California for any length of time, you're aware that the exact obverse has taken place, right? Much more spending on jails, much less spending on education and schools building construction. 143 new hospitals, 1,700 improved, 22,000 stadiums. And in the slideshow, you'll see some surprising constructions regarding stadiums. Big name football teams, college football teams have no idea that their stadia were built under the auspices of the WPA. 500 landing fields, 1,800 runways, including partial construction of LaGuardia Airport in New York City. State and municipal parks, CCC, 100 million trees planted, 6,000 miles of fire and forest trails created, etc. Education. Through 1941, 1 million enrolled in adult education courses. 37,000 children in classes in nursery schools. 280,000 children received music instruction. 67,000 received art instructions. Libraries were built. Zoos were constructed. Right? The point is that the construction projects undertaken by the WPA ran a gamut of different types of activity. Now, in addition to the construction projects, one should note the WPA's contribution to the cultural life of the country. Under the direction of Hallie Flanagan, the Federal Theater Project mounted 1,200 productions, including 300 new plays. Audiences were estimated at 25 million in 40 states. Many of this number had never seen a play prior to the WPA Federal Theaters Project. WPA programs included a Federal Music Project, Federal Arts Project, Federal Writers Project. The latter program was under the leadership of Henry Alsberg, and this is the project that produced the notable Slave Narrative collection. Individuals were hired to interview former slaves. And this is 1930, so you still had, of course, living former slaves. These were collected, 10,000 pages of interviews housed, of course, in the Library of Congress. And these are a treasure trove even today for researchers on the slave history of the United States. And last, let us not forget the famous murals that were produced by artists hired by the WPA. These dot the country, from post offices, those were mainly funded through the Treasury Department, to college buildings, to government buildings, and so forth. Included in this array were those painted by Diego Rivera, the famous Mexican muralist for the City College of San Francisco, Anton Refregier in the Recon Annex Post Office, San Francisco, and for fans of the great state of Missouri, Thomas Hart Benton in the Missouri State Capitol, Rotunda, Jefferson City. And if you haven't seen that mural, I recommend you travel to Jefferson City just for that purpose. There is no other reason to travel there, as far as I know. Now, let us turn to some numbers, and there should be a table posted so you can follow along. The first matter to note is the unemployment rate. Official estimates do not include WPA or CCC or other government workers in these programs as employed. Rather, they remained on the unemployment list as they were not working in private sector jobs. The adjusted rate includes those workers as employed. This results in a roughly 6% differential between the official rates and the adjusted rates, and paints a much rosier picture of the effects of the WPA and related programs in reducing unemployment. The second issue is the relationship between government deficit spending and inflation, which is, of course, a bugaboo if you're a conventional economist. In the 1930-32 period, when private spending fell precipitously and government spending was flat, the economy suffered deflation and tumbling gross domestic product. That is the worst case scenario in a capitalist economy, resulting in what Keynes would label pessimistic animal spirits, right? That things look very gloomy, and that curtails investment. The growing federal government deficits of 32-33 were not the result of increased spending, but declining tax revenues that resulted from declining incomes and spending in the private sectors. With increased government spending and accompanying deficits, GDP began to increase, as did prices. But observe, in the heyday of the WPA, the mid-30s, the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, rose a mere 3.7%. This is in the normal range for a capitalist economy, a bit high, but clearly does not represent real inflation. There's a difference between rising prices and inflation, necessary to induce a more optimistic animal spirit, a la Keynes, and indeed private investment increased during this period. In other words, government deficits, growing GDP had an impact on the private sector. The private sector responded, and this, in fact, greatly assisted the decline in unemployment in that period. Right? So, with rising investment, rising employment, real wages also rose. Now, in the table that you have, I only have manufacturing wages as a surrogate for all wages, right? But if you look at the table, you'll see that by 1936, real wages were back to the 1923-1925 level, okay? We also observe, given the information in front of you, that when the Roosevelt administration returned to its balanced budget program in 1937, things deteriorated. GDP fell, unemployment rose, real wages fell, private investment fell, and deflation against falling prices, that is, reared its ugly head, right? You don't want deflation. And, as is well known, with U.S. entry into World War II, government spending and deficits soared, but the economy finally recovered. Had the federal government spent as much in the 1930s to generate useful, constructive activities rather than destructive activities associated with war, it can be argued that the Depression would have been over within a year, even with the financial debacle of the late 1920s. Let's consider two standard complaints about government bureaucracies. They are too large, unwieldy, thus inefficient, and secondly, they are prone to capture by private interests, thus they do not serve the public good. Dealing with the second issue first, I have no doubt that this is a problem in the present period at a minimum. If one puts industry pimps in charge of the various bureaus, if one perpetrates a campaign denigrating public service, if one treats public servants as slaves, then government bureaus are ripe for such capture, right? And all one has to do is look at the Trump administration, but if you go back to the Bush and Obama periods, you will see the same developments, right? Indeed, an argument can be made that over the last 30 or so years, this has been an objective of various administrations, Democratic as well as Republicans, to reduce the effectiveness of public bureaus. The public servants of the 1930s seem to fit a quite different mold, at least in the main. One reads about the self-sacrificing work of a Harry Hopkins, of a Hallie Flanagan, of the government employees in the trenches. A quite altered picture emerges. These people were again, in the main, public-spirited, rather selfless, quite competent, and hard-working. We should not hypothesize about the behavior and character of people of different eras using the rather depraved standard of the current period. The other issue is the size of such bureaucracies. The WPA had a central administrative personnel of around 2,000 people, depending upon month and year. Most of WPA employees were at the state and district offices where the projects were actually undertaken and the hiring of project employees took place. Again, depending upon month and year, this number ranged from 15 to 35,000. The ratio of government employees to project workers, a more telling figure, ranged from 11 to 21 per 1,000 project workers, with the average running about 13 to 1,000. That is, less than 2% of the total number of workers in the WPA program consisted of administrative personnel. Compare that to General Motors, a private sector corporation. Right? Now, in conclusion, if one undertakes a careful examination of the WPA and other such programs during the Roosevelt administration, there is much to criticize. And I have a paper that's forthcoming that will criticize the WPA and other such programs. The programs in particular did not go far enough in reducing unemployment. In part, this was a consequence of inadequate government support. A balanced budget mantra ran through the entire Depression period, in part because WPA projects were purposefully selected to be non-competitive with the private sector, and in part due to an ideological constraint in that government-sponsored programs ran counter to the self-reliant individualism so widely taught in the United States. But an examination of previous government programs, such as the WPA, assists in developing a clearer understanding of various versions of a job guarantee program in both its positive and negative features. Obviously, the WPA was not such a program itself, but it points in that direction. Taking account of the differences in the eras of the 1930s and the 21st century, what lessons can be drawn from previous experiments? And the WPA was an experiment. And what can current imaginations produce in the present period? As Keynes stated at the beginning of the Great Depression, quote, "As soon as we have a new atmosphere of doing things, instead of one of smothering negation, everybody's brains will get busy, and there will be masses of claimants for attention, the precise character of which it would be impossible to specify beforehand." So with that, I leave you. Happy hunting. Do a lot of reading on the WPA and other such programs, and take the information into the current policy recommendations that will be forthcoming from the best and brightest of you. Take care.